Welcome to the Babylonian Podcast. I'm Michael Light, and I'm a Second Temple Jewish literature junkie and a big-time Bible nerd. And on this podcast, I provide the perspective of Jews that lived just before Jesus, from texts that we have like the apocrypha, pseudepigrapha, Dead Sea Scrolls, Philo, and more. With scholars, sages, and scriptures, let's Bible on. Hello and welcome back to Babylonia. In this episode, we will be talking about Esther. Now, you may be wondering, we're going through the apocrypha. Why are we going through Esther? Well, we are going through the apocryphal Esther, Septuagintal Esther, as I like to say, or sometimes called Greek Esther, or additions to Esther. If you have a Catholic Bible, and you open up to the first page of Esther, you will not open it up to chapter 1. You will open it up to chapter 11, which is followed by chapter 12, which is then followed by chapter 1, and then 2, and then 3, and then chapter 13, and then the end of chapter 3, and then 4, and then 13 again, and then 14, and then 15, and then 5, and 6, 7, 8, 16, the end of 8, 9, 10, even more verses in 10, and then 11 again. Confused yet? That is because the book of Esther had some additions when it was translated into Greek with the Septuagint. So, again, this is the series on the Apocrypha. If you haven't already, I would highly recommend you listen to the very first episode on Intro to the Apocrypha, as well as the second episode of my series on how to study the Scriptures. Searching the Scriptures, it's on how the Hebrew Bible was made, and that talks about the canonization of the Apocrypha. Not as important, but still relevant nonetheless. Now, the interesting thing about Esther is that it is not referenced in the New Testament. As far as I know, and as far as I've heard, Esther is the book that, one of the books that is not referenced in the New Testament at all. Canonical or non-canonical, apocryphal or not. And so you could say that we don't know if they were reading from the Septuagintal Esther or not. Jesus refers to the Hebrew canon and the original Esther. I'll kind of explain why we have the Esther that we do. But first, let me kind of explain what these additions are. So there are, depending on the version of Esther that you have, most, I'm assuming, are reading in NRSV if they're reading the Apocrypha. When Esther was translated into Latin in the Vulgate in the 4th century by St. Jerome, Jerome recognized that the Apocrypha was additional to the canon, and he translated it anyways. And he made a note before the apocryphal books that he put at the end that these are not part of the Hebrew canon. And for Esther, because of this, he took the parts of Esther that were in the Septuagint, and he put them all at the end. And so that's why we have later chapters that are originally, they were dispersed throughout in the Greek Esther, and then when they were translated into Latin, they were all moved to the end. And so, because that's the Bible that was versified and chapterified first, it was then taken and then replaced in the places where it needs to be, according to whatever makes the most sense. And now let me explain what the Septuagint is real quick. The Septuagint, again, I explained this in episode 2 of my Searching the Scriptures season, and I talk about how the Septuagint is the early translation of the or the later translation into Greek of the Hebrew scriptures. And there were some changes that were made in some, and some additions. There are even a little bit of additions onto the end of the book of Joshua. Is the only one that that's the biggest addition that I'm aware of, other than the addition to Daniel as well, which are really just unconnected stories. There's an addition that I'll get into in this apocrypha called the Prayer of Azariah and the Three, and those are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the furnace. That's a little prayer that they have. There's Bel and the dragon, and that is an addition to Esther, but that can be read on its own. And then there's also Susanna, which can also be read on its own, but is also sort of an addition to Esther, to Daniel, and those come with the Septuagint version of Daniel as well. So the same is said for Esther. Esther likewise had its own editions, but you can't really read the editions of Esther apart from Esther. So if you know anything about Esther, Esther is the one book in the Hebrew scriptures that does not once mention the name of God. That is one of the reasons why it was maybe the one book that the Hebrews were most hesitant to accept into the canon. It's the one scroll that we don't have among the Dead Sea Scrolls. And again, it's not referenced in the New Testament. Now, I still believe it's canonical because Jesus refers to the law, the prophets, and the writings. And, people just accept it. It's been accepted in church history and in Jewish history. Even though some people felt a little bit uncomfortable about a Jewish woman sleeping with a Gentile against the law, and Haman not bowing down and his incentives not being there. And so what the Septuagint version of Esther does is it makes it a little bit more godly. So in the very beginning, I'll go through chronologically and explain what the additions are. And it could be chapters 11 through 16, or additional verses to chapter 10 and 11 through 16, or some of the Bibles just say edition A, edition B, edition C, and I think the editions go all the way up to E or maybe F. But either way, NRSV is really good. It shows edition A, B, C, D, and all that, and it also has the chaptering. So anyways, in the Septuagint version, Mordecai is first introduced, and he is he has this dream. And let me read this dream real quick. This is what it says: noises and confusion, thunders and earthquake, tumult on the earth. Then two great dragons come forward, both ready to fight, and they roared terribly. At their roaring, every nation prepared for war, to fight against the righteous nation. It was a day of darkness and gloom, of tribulation and distress, affliction and great tumult on the earth. And the whole righteous nation was troubled. They feared the evils that threatened them and were ready to perish. Then they cried out to God, and at their outcry, as though from a tiny spring, there came a great river with abundant water. Light came, and the sun rose, and the lowly were exalted, and devoured those held in honor. Mordecai saw in this dream that God had determined to do, and after he awoke, he had it on his mind, seeking all day to understand it in every detail. Then the book of Esther goes into Mordecai resting in the courtyard when he hears about Gabbatha and Thara, two eunuchs of the king who are supposed to keep watch, but he overhears that they are trying to kill King Artaxerxes. And in Greek Esther, it's King Artaxerxes, which is an anachronism and not Ahasuerus or Ahasuerus. I don't know how to pronounce that. So anyways, Mordecai informs the king. The king looks at the two, he examines it, and they confess, and they're led away to be executed. And the king makes a record of this, which in the original Esther, it doesn't note that. It does talk about Mordecai revealing plans. but this is an additional version of that. And the king has Mordecai serve in his court because of that, and he rewards him for that. And then, and remember, he's going to reward Mordecai later on in the book. So this is kind of a contradiction, because the whole point of the king reading in the records, again, it's obviously providing this account saying that the king wrote down that this happened, made a permanent record of this in 12:4, so that later in chapter 4, when the king actually has that record read to him when he's kept up all night, he knows, oh, hey, I need to honor Mordecai. And then that's where the whole poetic reversal happens. But in this version of Esther, it sets that up, which is good, but then it actually contradicts itself, because he already has rewarded him. He still rewards him later, but it says that the king orders that Mordecai serve in the court and be rewarded. And then it talks about Haman of Hamadatha, who is determined to injure Mordecai and his people because of the two eunuchs of the king. So in this version of Esther, Haman is not only angry that Mordecai won't bow down to him. Again, that is still in the story of Greek Septuagintal Esther. However, it's even more true that before that, Haman is already angry at Mordecai for foiling the plans of these two people that were going to kill the king. So you start to think that Haman was actually with them. And, this is in line with Haman's character to be money hungry and want to take the place of the king. You'll see this later in chapter 4 when he thinks that the king has asked how he can honor Haman, when he's actually asking how he can honor Mordecai. So anyways, then he has his big party, and he wants to show off Vashti, and his party is insanely big. This is just it's going on for 180 days, and this is in original Esther. I'm explaining original Esther just for those that haven't known, but these chapters are dispersed throughout, so I'm also going to be explaining those chapters. And there are some parts where the verses have been just ever so slightly changed, and so I'll explain that as well, at least the ones that I could remember. And if I couldn't remember them, then they probably weren't that important anyways. Let's just go with that. So anyways, Vashti, the king calls for Vashti to be to show her off to all the peoples of the nations in her crown. And I've heard it said that the Talmud interprets this as the king wanted to show off Queen Vashti in only her crown. And anyway, in other words, he wanted to show her off naked to all his people. And for some weird reason, she did not want to be exposed in front of the whole known world. And so the king is angry about this. So he sets a law in place that makes all women have to submit to men and bow down to them, because the queen refusing to be shown off sexually to everybody is actually defiance against all men. And so the stupid king who can't make a decision for himself has to ask for advice, and everybody else has to write the law for him, as happens throughout the rest of the book of Esther. Anyways, later, the king actually desires Vashti again, and so he searches for beautiful women to be found for him. Mordecai has a cousin whose name is Esther, and Esther, as Mordecai told her not to, she does not reveal that she is a Jew, so that she will be safe. And another thing to be noted is, because even though they're even though Esther and Mordecai are cousins, Esther's parents had died, and so Mordecai is kind of her legal guardian, so as to say. And so Mordecai's watching out for her, talking with her often, being a very good cousin. So anyways, Mordecai, Haman is advancing, and he takes precedence over all the king's friends, is what it says in chapter 3, verse 1. And when he goes through the court, everybody bows down to him except for Mordecai, who doesn't. And when the other officials of the king ask him why he doesn't, he does not listen to them. And they tell Haman that Mordecai is not bowing down to Haman according to his command. And Mordecai had told him that he was a Jew. So Haman puts in the plan to end all Jews, because it's not enough to punish even just Mordecai. He tells Artaxerxes this plan to end the Jews because their laws are different. And Artaxerxes, being the dumb dolt that he is, who can't make a decision for himself, says, yeah, sure, go ahead and write that law. And so Haman goes ahead and does that for free. Anyways, the next edition shows pretty much what that letter has to say. And then the story continues, and Mordecai learns that there is this plot that on one day they're going to go out and kill all the Jews. So he goes and he tells Esther, and Esther, he tells Esther that he needs to go, and she needs to go to the king and ask for them to be saved on their behalf. And Esther says, oh yeah, but don't you remember that law that the Dingus King put in place so that if I ever go before him without him asking for me, then I can be put to death? And Mordecai is pretty much like, well, you know, what if you were put in this place for such a time as this? He says, even if you keep quiet at such a time, help and protection will come to the Jews from another quarter. But you and your father's family will perish. Yet who knows whether it was not for such a time as this that you were made queen. And you want to keep the apocalypse, or the dream that Mordecai had in mind. That is potentially the reason why this is added in to the book of Esther, to make it a little bit more apocalyptic and show that Mordecai kind of already had this thought that maybe Esther would have some major play in this. And that's what motivates him to do that. Anyways, the next section has an addition where Mordecai prays to God, and he calls him the king over everything, who made everything, who knows everything, and how he says this. He says in verse 12 of chapter 13, you know all things, you know, O Lord, that it was not in insolence or pride or for any love of glory that I did this and refused to bow down to this proud Haman. For I would have been willing to kiss the soles of his feet to save Israel. But I did this so that I might not set human glory above the glory of God. And I will not bow down to anyone but you, who are my Lord. And I will not do these things in pride. And now, O Lord God and King, God of Abraham, spare your people, for the eyes of your foes are upon us, to annihilate us. And they desire to destroy the inheritance that has been yours from the beginning. And then he brings up the exodus of Israel from Egypt, and he cries out for God to spare them. And then there's another addition, chapter 14, and I'll just straight up read this chapter for you, because it's just really good. Then Queen Esther, seized with deadly anxiety, fled to the Lord. She took off her splendid apparel and put on garments of distress and mourning. And instead of costly perfumes, she covered her head with ashes and dung. And she utterly humbled her body. Every part that she loved to adorn, she covered with her tangled hair. She prayed to the Lord God of Israel and said, O my Lord, you only are our King. Help me, who am alone and have no helper but you. For my danger is in my hand. Ever since I was born, I have heard the tribe of my family that you, O Lord, took Israel out of all the nations and our ancestors from among all their forebears for an everlasting inheritance, and that you did for them all that you promised. And then she confesses the sins and their slavery, and how they even then they were idol worshippers, and she praises them, and she talks about the vanity of nations praising their idols, and she asks for him to not give them over into shame, but to make his name great, and to give her wisdom in speaking. And to save them with his mighty hand. And then in verse 16, this is what she says. She says, "You know my necessity, that I abhor the sign of my proud position, which is upon my head on the days when I appear in public. I abhor it like a filthy rag, and I do not wear it on the days when I am at leisure. And your servant has not eaten at Haman's table, and I have not honored the king's feast, or drunk the wine of libations. Your servant has had no joy since the day that I was brought here until now, except in you, O Lord God of Abraham. O God, whose might is over all, hear the voice of the despairing, and save us from the hands of evildoers, and save me from my fear." So you can see this obvious apologetic in their prayers. The additions were obviously to explain that Mordecai was not bowing out of pride. Now, it doesn't say that in the Hebrew Esther, the original one, but it does make it explicit, because it doesn't give any reason for why Mordecai doesn't bow to Haman. But in the first prayer, Mordecai's prayer, he makes it totally clear in his prayer to God that he was only being a pious, faithful Jew that was following the law of God, and that he would have even kissed his feet if it was to save Israel. And Esther, even though she went through this 1-year treatment of perfume, she actually hated the whole thing. She grew up loving Israel and knowing that God had given them the land faithfully, and that it was only because of their sins that she confessed that they were brought into exile. And she says how she does not enjoy being with the king, or feasting on the unkosher things of the king. In case Hebrew Esther did not make that clear, Greek Septuagintal Esther is making that perfectly clear. And then in the next edition, chapter 15, on the third day, when she ended her prayer, she took off the garments in which she had worshipped and arrayed herself in splendid attire. And then she goes off, and it talks about how they take her train that's following her in her splendid attire. She's radiant with perfect beauty and happy as if beloved, but her heart is frozen with fear. And she goes through all the doors to stand before the king, and he's seated on his royal throne, clothed in the full array of his majesty, all covered with gold and precious stones, but he's terrifying. And the king lifts his face, flushed with splendor. He looked at her in fierce anger. And Queen Esther falters, she turns pale, she faints and collapses on the head of the maid who went in front of her. But then God changes the spirit of the king to gentleness. And in alarm, he springs from his throne. He takes her in her arms until she comes to herself, and he comforts her with soothing words and says to her, "What is it, Israel? I'm your husband. Take courage. You will not die, for our lie applies only to our subjects. Come near and speak to me." And then he comforts her, and he asks, "What do you?" That's the kind of the changed version. This is an addition, but it takes off a little bit of the beginning of chapter 5, the first 2 verses, where it doesn't really show any emotion from the king. He just instantly accepts her. But to add to the drama of it all, Septuagint Esther takes it to the next level by showing the beauty of Esther, the splendor of the king, and his fierce anger. And the only explanation for his change to not being angry is because God changes his attitude. And even there's this contradiction, because he says later that you will not die, because our law only applies to our subjects. So come near. But that kind of contradicts the other part of the edition that says that he was flushed with anger, which you have to wonder why he was flushed with anger if that was true. And again, you could just explain that by saying that, God had changed his countenance, and so because of that, he had a new interpretation of the law. So anyways, Esther invites him and Haman to a dinner. And so Haman goes off, and he's going home, and He tells his wife about how he's been invited to this dinner with Esther, and only him and the king and queen are going there. But he says, even that will give me no pleasure as long as I see Mordecai the Jew in the courtyard. And his wife says, let gallows be made 50 cubits high, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go merrily with the king to the dinner. This advice pleased Haman, and so the gallows was prepared. So that night, in the Hebrew version, it just says, sleep fled from the king. The king couldn't sleep. But again, Septuagintal Esther makes this subtle change by saying, that night the Lord took sleep from the king. So he gave orders to his secretary to bring the book of the daily records and to read to him. And he finds the words about Mordecai and how he told the king about the 2 royal eunuchs who were on guard and sought to lay hands on the king to kill him. And he asks what they did to Mordecai. And the servants say, you haven't done anything. Which again, that's a contradiction with addition. But anyways, the king asks, who's in the courtyard? And it happens to be Haman. And so he calls Haman in. Haman thinks, the king asks him, what should be done for the person that the king honors? And Haman thinks, that must be me. So he says, dress him as the king and have him paraded as if he's the king. And the king says, oh, great, that's a fantastic idea. Why don't you do just that to Mordecai? So he does. And he's humbled, and he goes home, and he tells his wife and his friends. And his wife says, buddy, if Mordecai is of the Jewish people and you have begun to be humiliated before him, you're surely going to fall. And you will not be able to defend yourself. And she says, this is what she says. This is an addition, because remember, the original Hebrew Esther does not use the name God. She says, you will not be able to defend yourself because the living God is with them. And it's right then with the eunuchs come, and they hurry to bring Haman to the banquet with Esther. So Haman and the king are at the second banquet. At the first one, she had invited them to the second one. And the king asks, what is it that you want? And Esther says, my people are being attacked, and they're trying to be killed. And the king says, who's this person? And Esther says, it's Haman. And Haman is terrified. And the king walks out because he's so mad. He comes back in and he sees Haman molesting her. And he says, who are you, pal? And at that word, the servants take him away to execute him. On that day, Esther is given all that Haman used to have. And the king gives the ring that he had given to Haman earlier to write a decree, to give to Mordecai to write a new decree, because you can't undo your decree according to the book of Esther. And so Haman writes the letter to all the provinces saying that they can now defend themselves. And that's the edition E, chapter 16. And then they're posted throughout, and all the people defend themselves. And it goes into the more details about why Purim is celebrated because of that. And later it goes on in chapter 10. It talks about how Mordecai acted with authority on behalf of the king. And he's great in the kingdom as well as honored by the Jews. And his way of life was such as to make him beloved to his whole nation. And then there are additional verses even to chapter 10. These are what they say. Mordecai said, these things have come from God, for I remember the dream that I had concerning these matters, and none of them has failed to be fulfilled. There was the little spring that became a river, and there was light and sun and abundant water. The river is Esther, whom the king married and made queen. The 2 dragons are Haman and myself. The nations are those that gathered to destroy the name of the Jews. And my nation, this is Israel, who cried out to God and was saved. The Lord has saved his people. The Lord has rescued us from all these evils. God has done great signs and wonders that have never happened among these nations. For this purpose, he has made 2 lots, one for the people of God and one for all the nations. And these lots came to the hour and the moment and the day of decision before God and among all the nations. And God remembered his people and vindicated his inheritance. And so actually this is pretty interesting because the book of Esther explains that the Jews defending themselves is the reason why they celebrate Purim. Now, Purim ends with im. In Hebrew, im is plural. Now, if you know the basics of Esther, a pur is a lot. It's pretty much like a die you roll to find out, to make a decision. And it's on that basis that Haman chooses the day that he's going to have the Jews killed. And it's on that basis that they roll the die to have them saved. And the Greek Esther explains that the reason that it's plural is because there's a lot for the people of God and a lot for all of the other nations. And then in chapter 11 it ends, and it says, in the 4th year of the reign of Ptolemy and Cleopatra, Dosiathus, who had said that he was a priest and a Levite, and his son Ptolemy brought to Egypt the preceding letter about Purim, which they said was authentic, and they had been translated by Lysicamus, son of Ptolemy, one of the residents of Jerusalem. And that is the end of the Greek additions to Esther. As you can tell, there were additions and slight, just very slight changes made to some of the wording throughout the book to make it more godly and pious, to explain those things, and I've already kind of explained some of those. And now, this was obviously not a separate tradition from Esther, but when Esther was translated, it seems that the authors were bothered by the fact that Esther was eating unkosher, and so they had to explain that away, that she was married to and even sleeping with a Gentile, and that there's no explanation for Mordecai not bowing down to Haman. Also, God is not explained, so not only do they have to add things in throughout, but they even make little additions where it says that the Lord changed the wrath and fury of the king to be good towards Esther, and that the Lord took away sleep from the king so that he would come to the annals. And it makes it more apocalyptic. Apocalypse having to do with revelation and not the end of the world. It does that by giving Mordecai a dream as if he's a prophet, and then showing him the interpretation at the end. And Esther makes a lot of sense without this. But this book is actually, in a sense, you could read this and say that they weren't necessarily bothered by these things. They're actually highlighting things that aren't specifically stated in the text. If you're reading through the book of Esther and you come to the idea that it's a secular book, as some critical scholars might say, then you should probably think about the reason that it was even considered in the canon in the first place. The fact is that Esther was probably added into the canon to, first of all, to show how Esther is like a prototype of Christ, who suffers for her people, fasts for 3 days, afflicting herself, going through a metaphorical 3-day death before she goes into the king's chamber and asks to have 2 feasts. And on the second feast, she stands up against the person who persecutes her, and she asks for salvation, and she's the one that brings salvation to her whole nation. And not only that, but some people pretend to be Jews. Well, actually, that's what it says in the Hebrew. That's one more thing I forgot. In the Greek, it says that people circumcise themselves and become Jews because they're afraid that they will be destroyed by the Jews when they can defend themselves. So it's highlighting the fact that God was the one taking away the sleep from Mordecai, and that God was the one that changed the king to accept Esther. And so I think the point of Esther is that God's name isn't used because it's to show how we experience God a lot of the times. We don't see him reveal himself through his word as he does through the prophets and much of the Tanakh and the apostles. And that's how Esther is portraying things. And so you can, like most critical scholars do, just read everything in the text as being a coincidence, or you could consider the fact that whoever wrote Esther is trying to make you think critically, not just about the story of Esther, but about how you yourself can see God in your everyday life. And so, as with most manuscript differences, the one that is harder to make sense of is probably the right one. And the Hebrew Esther is the one that has been accepted historically until the church became mostly Gentiles and were reading the Bible in Greek anyway, so they were referring to the Septuagint because they didn't really know Hebrew. And so, of course, they came to read Greek Esther instead. But really, the Hebrew Esther is the more original. Anyways, something I forgot to mention at the beginning of this episode that I'll say right now. Because Esther is additions to Esther rather than unique stories, I have not done an overview for it. My written overviews were kind of to replace what the Bible Project has not yet done. And since you can already see their poster, if you look at that and then listen to this podcast episode, it might bring out even more, so I recommend you do that. But I still do have the notes on the biblical allusions to Esther and all the other apocrypha, so make sure that you're keeping up with that. With all that said, I'll see you next time in Babylonia.